Muammar Gaddafi, legacy of a Pan-African visionary. Few leaders in modern African history have cast as long and controversial a shadow as Muammar Gaddafi. Rising to power in Libya in 1969, Gaddafi ruled for over 4 decades and redefined Libya's role in Africa and the world. While often criticized for his authoritarian rule, Gaddafi's efforts to promote Pan-African unity, economic independence, and cultural renaissance remain influential to this day. The rise of a revolutionary. Gaddafi came to power as a 27-year-old army officer through a bloodless coup that overthrew King Idris I. Influenced by Gamal Abdel Nasser's Arab nationalism and anti-imperialism, he began reshaping Libya into a Jamahiriya, or state of the masses, where he claimed direct democracy would replace traditional governance. Libya's vast oil reserves enabled him to fund sweeping reforms and foreign policy ambitions. Pan-Africanism and the United States of Africa. Gaddafi's Pan-African dream was inspired by figures like Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere. He envisioned a United States of Africa, a continent united by a single government, military, passport, and gold-backed currency. He criticized the colonial borders that divided Africa and believed only continental unity could free Africa from neocolonial influence. He consistently argued that Africa's reliance on the West made it vulnerable. His plan included a continental army, a single currency backed by African gold reserves, a common passport, a centralized AU parliament and executive authority. His calls echoed across summits and speeches, but implementation was hampered by resistance from African leaders who feared losing sovereignty. From OAU to AU, Gaddafi's institutional influence. Gaddafi played a leading role in the transformation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, into the African Union, AU. In 1999, he hosted the Sirte Declaration in Libya, where leaders agreed to create a more robust and dynamic union. The AU officially launched in 2002 with Gaddafi as its principal architect. He offered to fund AU operations and even volunteered Libya to host its central institutions. Gaddafi envisioned the AU as more than symbolic, a force capable of managing Africa's affairs without Western interference. He proposed the creation of an African standby force and a continental intelligence sharing system. Despite skepticism from fellow leaders, Gaddafi's persistence led to the formation of some AU organs, including the Pan-African Parliament and the African Court on Human and People's Rights. His push for a unified foreign policy continues to influence AU agendas today. The Gold Dinar, a threat to the global financial order. One of Gaddafi's most radical proposals was the establishment of a gold-backed African currency, the Gold Dinar. The aim was to break the economic stranglehold of the US dollar and euro. Allow African countries to trade oil and commodities in their own currency. Create an independent African monetary system. This idea sparked global attention. Gaddafi proposed that all oil-producing African countries sell oil in gold dinars. He argued this would protect Africa from Western monetary manipulation and debt traps. The gold dinar never materialized, partly due to lack of support from African central banks and fears of provoking Western retaliation. Nevertheless, the concept is still discussed among African economists and Pan-African think tanks. Economic diplomacy and strategic investments. Gaddafi used Libya's oil wealth to invest in infrastructure across Africa. Through the Libyan African Investment Portfolio, LAP, and the Libya Africa Investment Fund, LAIP, he financed telecommunications networks in Uganda and Zambia, hospitality and banking in Mali and Kenya, agricultural ventures in Sudan and Chad, road and transportation links in Niger and Burkina Faso. He was seen as a financier who imposed no conditions, unlike the IMF or World Bank. This made him popular among African heads of state seeking funds without neoliberal constraints. His investments extended Libya's political reach and strengthened his vision of Africa-led development. Supporting liberation movements. Gaddafi supported armed and political movements throughout Africa. His aid went to the ANC in South Africa, SWAPO in Namibia, Frelimo in Mozambique, the SPLA in Sudan. He provided weapons, training, and funding to these groups. For this, he earned the respect of leaders like Nelson Mandela, who called him a true friend. However, his support for Charles Taylor in Liberia and Foday Sankoh in Sierra Leone earned him criticism for fueling conflict. To Gaddafi, supporting revolution was part of his anti-imperialist duty. But critics argue that his ideological zeal often exacerbated regional instability. Cultural and traditional diplomacy. In 2008, Gaddafi convened a gathering of more than 200 African kings and chiefs, proclaiming himself the King of Kings of Africa. While mocked in Western media, this move revealed his grasp of Africa's cultural politics. He sought legitimacy not just through official channels but also by aligning with indigenous power structures. He funded cultural festivals, Islamic institutions, and media outlets promoting African unity. His charisma and financial generosity earned him grassroots support, especially among rural populations and traditional elites. Complex global relations and isolation. Gaddafi's foreign relations were tumultuous. For decades, he was regarded as a rogue state leader by the West. Libya faced UN and US sanctions after the Lockerbie bombing. Gaddafi responded by strengthening ties with Africa and Asia. However, after 2003, he surprised the world by renouncing WMD programs and cooperating with Western governments. Libya paid compensation to Lockerbie victims, and relations thawed. European leaders began visiting Tripoli, and Libya re-entered global financial markets. Yet this détente ended with the 2011 uprising. Gaddafi's crackdown on protesters led to a NATO-led intervention, justified by a 2P, responsibility to protect. He was eventually killed by rebels, with NATO support. Many African leaders saw his death as a Western-engineered regime change, undermining AU peace efforts. It reignited fears that Africa remains vulnerable to external manipulation. The collapse of Libya and regional fallout. Post-Gaddafi Libya descended into civil war and chaos. Militias seized weapons, and jihadist groups expanded across the Sahel. Former Tuareg fighters returned to Mali, triggering a rebellion and French intervention. Libya became a hub for human trafficking, arms smuggling, and transnational crime. The AU, weakened by the loss of Gaddafi's leadership and funding, struggled to respond effectively. His absence exposed the institution's dependency on strong individual patrons. Authoritarianism and internal repression. While Gaddafi advocated for people's power abroad, his domestic rule was autocratic. His Green Book promoted a bizarre mix of socialism, tribalism, and direct democracy, but in reality, Libya became a surveillance state. Political opposition was banned. Media was tightly controlled. Revolutionary committees enforced loyalty. Prisons like Abu Salim became infamous for torture and extrajudicial killings. Dissidents fled or disappeared. International human rights groups labeled his regime oppressive and unaccountable. Despite this, many Libyans benefited from subsidized education, healthcare, and housing. Gaddafi's populist policies lifted Libya to one of the highest HDIs in Africa. This dichotomy, progressive welfare with political repression, defines the paradox of his rule. A divided legacy across the continent. After his death, Gaddafi's legacy varies by region. North Africa, mixed feelings, stability versus oppression. West Africa, admired for investments and diplomacy. Southern Africa, respected for supporting liberation. Central East Africa, divided opinions, with some condemning his role in conflicts. Among African youth, especially Pan-Africanists, Gaddafi is increasingly seen as a misunderstood visionary. His critiques of the West and calls for African independence resonate today. However, his authoritarianism and erratic policies also serve as cautionary tales. Can African unity emerge from top-down control? Can liberation coexist with autocracy? The questions that remain. Gaddafi's life poses enduring questions. Was he a liberator or a despot? Was his vision too ambitious or sabotaged by global powers? Can Africa build unity through visionary leadership, or must it come from democratic consensus? Whatever the answer, Gaddafi forced the continent, and the world, to confront the idea that Africa need not remain divided, dependent, and voiceless. Summary. Muammar Gaddafi remains one of Africa's most iconic and polarizing figures. From founding the African Union to proposing a gold-backed currency, supporting liberation movements, and funding continental infrastructure, his legacy is deeply embedded in Africa's political fabric. Though his methods were authoritarian, his Pan-African ideals continue to inspire debate, hope, and reflection on the future of African sovereignty and unity.